Welcome to the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. If your job involves working with or influencing people's behavior, this podcast offers invaluable insights into what makes people tick. Through personal interviews that are thoughtful and surprising, we explore the full range of the roots to people smarts that can help you make or break your own career. My name is Marie Gervais, and with a PhD in culture and learning in the workplace and my own cultural journey, I bring the mysteries of human beings at work around the world to you. Through conversations with very diverse people, examining the groups they were born into and the ones they chose to belong to, my podcast takes a deep dive into why people do what they do and how they belong. Hone your skills to manage others and to be a better human being at work with the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast. And now for today's episode. Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners. Today, I have for you our most distinguished guest who shares many of the same interests as me, so I'm really excited to interview him. His name is Dr. Yosi Amram, and he is a distinguished psychologist, an executive coach catering to CEOs, entrepreneurs, and influential leaders, and a pioneer researcher in the field of spiritual intelligence. He holds an MBA from Harvard University and a PhD from Sofia University in Clinical Transpersonal Psychology. He is committed to enabling individuals to unlock their potential through spiritual intelligence, which I'm going to ask him a lot about during the podcast. And prior to doing this work, he was the founder and CEO of two companies. He started out life as an engineer, and the first company was early machine learning that involved delivering personal newsletters to people via fax and gathering intelligence. And then the second company was internet security, encryption of digital signatures. So that's a big switch from those two companies into spiritual intelligence. So I'm really excited to interview you. Welcome, Dr. Yosi Amram.
Thank you. Thank you, Marie. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you, and thanks for the kind words.
Well, let's start a little bit with where you're from, your childhood, your family, a little bit about you, the personal side, since we've got all the other things in the bio.
So I was born and raised in Tel Aviv, Israel. My parents were refugee immigrants from Iraq who fled Iraq following Second World War around the time of the establishment of Israel. They met in Israel and they started over. They lost all their possessions and their homes and so on. And what can I say? Like all Israeli men and citizens, despite my pacifistic leaning, I was drafted into the military and spent 3 years there, winning a number of leadership awards, and had the fastest promotion record in the history of my regiment. But despite my success, that military experience really chafed at my soul, and I did not like the command and control model of the military, which is effective and necessary in battle, but not always best for human potential development. So I got interested in this idea of more humane approaches of leadership, and that became kind of a driving force of my life, which is why I ultimately just chose to be an entrepreneur, so I could see if I could experiment with building a culture and an environment that inspires and supports people's development and growth for each individual in a community and a team context. So that was kind of the genesis of my interest in leadership from the military.
Did you have siblings?
No, I was an only child, for better or worse.
And you grew up in Tel Aviv?
Yeah, in Tel Aviv. Up in a one-bedroom apartment that with my grandparents sleeping on the couch in a living room, and me and my parents kind of divided the bedroom through a partition, and that's where I grew up until my grandparents moved into their own studio when I was 5 or 6. So
I see. And where are you living currently?
I live currently in the San Francisco Bay Area. My office in Palo Alto, and I spend most of my time, actually my home is near the ocean in Santa Cruz in California.
Lovely.
Every morning I take walks on the beach like I did this morning at dawn. I was down there at 6:45 this morning, and the lights were changing color and the birds were flying and the pelicans were surfing the waves and diving to catch fish. It's always very inspiring and beautiful for me.
Oh, yes, it would be for anybody.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a few questions about your childhood and your early adult years. Can you think of a couple of incidents that stood out for you? They could be positive, they could be negative, they could be in between, but they just stand out for you as formative.
Sure. Well, I already mentioned my military experience, which I think was quite formative.
Go back a little bit earlier, maybe.
Yeah, no, I was going to, but okay. Well, a formative experience, what may sound heavy, is when I was 9 years old and I went to the movie theaters by myself without my parents knowing. And I was molested by a stranger in that movie theater. And that was a difficult experience, which I repressed till it kind of bubbled up in therapy when I was 40 years old. So,
And that's something that happens to a lot of boys, and they frequently don't say anything about it. People think only girls get molested or that it's not a large percentage of boys, but I think 1 in 3 children who are molested are boys. So it's a
yeah,
very
no,
common
right.
experience.
I know. I'm glad
Yeah.
you're of it. And I'm glad you, I wrote a whole paper related to this, like no shame and shame. But for me, that was a very shameful experience. I took on the belief that there was something wrong with me, that I was damaged goods. And yeah, and that happens to lots of young boys. And because it's not recognized and it's so unmanly and so on, it causes a lot of problems. And the cycle of violence continues. So,
It does. So that was something that happened to you that was really traumatizing for sure. And how do you think getting over that contributed to your leadership and your sense of who you are now?
well, it certainly raised my sensitivity to this whole notion of boundaries and, sexual violence, and both advocating for boys and women in the workplace and elsewhere. So,
Well, it helped you to be more sensitive to suffering and to be an advocate for others, right? So those are certainly necessary for good leadership.
yeah, which relates to the other formative experience that I had, which actually touches on a similar theme in a way. That was when I was 4 years old, and I was running around the yard in pre-kindergarten. And the day before, I learned a trick from some older boys that if someone's walking or running, you can flick their legs and then they can trip and fly over. And we were in the yard of this preschool and a bunch of kids running. And I decided to do an experiment and see whether I could do this on the boy that was running in front of me. So I flicked their leg and they flew and landed and scraped their knee and started bleeding and crying. And I was kind of horrified, like, oh my God. And the teacher yelled, who did it? Who did it? What happened? And I just shrieked in shame and horrified that I can cause someone else pain like that. And that was also a formative experience, this idea that I could cause other suffering.
When you're 4, you don't typically realize that there's a consequence to your actions, and
Yeah.
it takes a while for that to kick in.
Right.
And there's so many stories of children that did something that seemed cruel, but for them, it was an experiment. And then when they saw what happened, they were just devastated. So I think that's another common experience that children have, but it's interesting that you would remember it so well.
Yeah, I think it's probably the earliest conscious memory that I have. It was kind of traumatic because I took on a level of shame that I did that, and I shrunk and hid there when the teacher yelled, who did it? And, I didn't come forward and they didn't find out, but it was very formative, and wanting to make sure that in the future I don't cause pain and suffering and harm and violence to others. That kind of got imprinted in my psyche and my soul through that negative experience.
Yes, for sure. Did that also affect your desire to either to stand up when you did something that was a mistake and admit it, or to stand up for others when they were in a situation where they were ashamed?
Yeah, I never connected that. But that's a good insight. I do think that one of my values is to own my mistakes and to speak up and apologize. I think that that's super important. It helps me feel clear and free of the burden of the guilt or whatever. And it's just so important in relationships, be they at work or romantic and elsewhere, to create a culture, an environment, and value system where we're willing to be vulnerable and own our mistakes. And that increases the sense of safety for everyone. And it supports deeper trust and mutual learning where we can learn from our experiences. So yeah, I never connected that explicitly. So thank you for helping me see that.
I think it's because you're interested in spiritual intelligence, and that has to do with probably the development of spiritual intelligence too. I'm not sure. I'm just throwing some things out there, but I know that making mistakes or taking ownership for something or not can have such a huge effect. Not so long ago, I was working with an oil and gas company with their site managers. And one of the site managers, I'd say, is the most honest person I've ever met about his own failings. It was really interesting to see how he did that without shame. And he galvanized all the other site managers to start an improved communications program and standardization of some of their policies and procedures by saying, I don't know what I'm doing, but let's learn how to use this platform together and take turns. And that way we can all learn how to facilitate meetings better. And I'll go first because I'm probably going to be the one with the least experience of the whole group. And because he was so open and vulnerable about that, the others who were much more macho were just so much more willing to be who they were and be authentic too. And so he'd say, Oh, I made this mistake, my bad, but I tried to correct it by doing this. Do you think that's going to work? Like it was just lovely. I've never seen anyone in that particular industry be so open without feeling, it didn't feel like he was judging himself or judging others. He was just opening up the forum. It was really interesting.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, I think of it as you said, one value is openness. The other one is just commitment to the truth and love of the truth. So,
Yeah, it is.
these are spiritual qualities, the love of truth. And so when we love the truth, we want to know the truth. We want to reveal the truth for ourselves, for others. So rather than trying to manage our self-image, which closes us from the truth and closes us from the ability to learn. So yeah, that's beautiful.
Nice synopsis and interpretation. Much appreciated. So let me ask you, were you going to say something about your experience in the military, or were you going to move on to something else? I sort of jumped in before when you started to speak about it.
No, I think I said the main things that even though I was successful at it and so on, there was something about it that chafed at me and ultimately led to my interest in more humane approaches to leadership. So I think that's the main thing. I don't.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I didn't cut you off. So I'm really interested in this piece that you went into engineering and created two companies that were financially successful enough that you could take them public, and then went into psychology. Like, explain this to me. I need help.
Need help. I need help. Well, the reason I went to psychology is to get help to understand myself. One of the things that I haven't highlighted yet is that, during one of those companies, after its public offering, I experienced sort of a psychospiritual breakdown and what's in the spiritual traditions called the dark night of the soul. And even though the company was successful, the stock price was going up. My mom had just passed away in the midst of our IPO. I didn't have the time and space to process it. And I'm not sure exactly all of what happened, but I experienced sort of a spiritual awakening that shattered and broke through this illusion of separation of the separate egoic self. And I felt sort of the interconnectedness of everything. And that also threw me into a manic episode, which was, as you can imagine, quite problematic, being a CEO of a public company. But I had a lot of insights into the future of the internet and foresaw a lot of the things that became the social networks and so on. And I became very consumed with this vision and trying to get individual, which was the name of the company, to be the forefront leader of that. So I had a lot of ideas. A lot of them proved in hindsight to be right on, but trying to get my board and my team to execute on all these ideas was just way too much. And I was overly consumed with this vision and didn't have a very good intake for listening to other people's concerns or how to execute in an organized way rather than haphazard going after too many things, because they were all very exciting. So that led to basically my board putting me on, quote unquote, a voluntary leave of absence. They passed the resolution, even though it wasn't a voluntary thing because it wasn't my thing, but that was the board's resolution that I would be put on a voluntary leave of absence. And that was very painful and traumatic. It became front page stories in the business section of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And I felt felt a lot of shame for getting pushed out of the company, which was my baby, and so on. So that led to my trying to understand my identity and how and why I was so attached to being the CEO of the company, and also trying to understand what that whole experience was about. So that led me to want to go into therapy and understand myself, and also understand this experience of oneness, and that is talked about in the spiritual traditions. Was it just hallucination, or was there something more real or essential or fundamental? And so that kind of was what led me to want to pursue a degree as a clinical psychologist. Also, along the way, I started mentoring and coaching other entrepreneurs. I made enough money through the IPOs and so on, and I started to become an angel investor, investing in other entrepreneurs and going on their board as their first founding investor, and then coaching and mentoring them about building their company. And what I discovered, though, that I could give them the greatest of advice, but they couldn't implement it because of psychological blocks they had having to do with the relationships of their father or mother that they are projecting on their investor or board member or management team members, or whatever issues they had that we all carry, like I mentioned some of them. And so in order to help them at a deeper level, I felt I needed deeper understanding and greater tools. And that was the other reason I went and got a PhD and became a psychologist, both to be able to work with my clients at a deeper way, which I do now as a coach, as a therapist, and as well as to understand myself and what had happened to me in that spiritual emergency experience, which then I discovered is actually pretty well covered and understood in the literature.
It is. The dark night of the soul and having an experience of transcendence and oneness is very common. And the other one that you mentioned, the piece about being a sort of frenetic, obsessive CEO, is also very common, because people who are visionary tend to not make good managers, and they're really inspiring initially, and they gather people and start making money, but they don't always listen well. And they don't always realize where their weaknesses are in addition to what they're good at. And they want everybody to be like them, which would make, of course, everything fall apart. So that's interesting. I've met quite a few CEOs that had a sort of shattering experience where their company turned against them, or where all their clients left them, or something like that. But they didn't have any experience of oneness, and they didn't have an experience that they felt they were connected and that they had to understand something. So I'm interested that that's an experience that you had.
Yeah, well, thank you. I understand and agree that a lot of visionary entrepreneurs are, exactly great at that, the visionary entrepreneur. But I think what distinguishes ones that can become also great leaders is that they develop interpersonal capacities and emotional intelligence and spiritual intelligence, which then enables them to grow and scale and lead others and empower others and inspire others, and not just have a vision about the future and follow me, which is important. It's one model of leadership, but there's other models of leadership which are more, might be called leading from behind. So there's leading from the front, which is like you see somewhere and it's like you run ahead and you say basically to everybody, follow me, and people could be inspired and follow the leader, and that's great. But, I think great leaders can also drop back and lead from behind, which is more of a facilitative role of leadership. You can think about it perhaps in terms of yin and yang of leadership. The yang is leading from the front. Some might consider more masculine quality, although I know that's a problematic term these days. But the facilitative role of leadership, where you're empowering others and helping others discover their own way, is just as powerful a leader. And I think the best leaders can flow between leading from the front to leading from behind.
Yes. You want to develop the capacity of your people. And sometimes you need to take charge, and sometimes you need to move to the back and watch what's happening, for sure.
Them and help them through asking questions and help them discover the way.
Yes, exactly. People are more likely to do the things they've discovered than the things they're told to do by others.
Exactly.
So let me ask you about the groups you were born into and how they've influenced your sense of self and culture and leadership capacity development. Were you born in Iraq or born in Israel?
In Israel, my parents.
In Israel. Yeah, your parents were refugees from Iraq. So the Iraqi culture must have been part of your experience, and then your grandparents living with you was part of your experience. And then I'm assuming that you're also Jewish, which would be part of the experience as well. And then your parents would have been a minority because the Jews in Iraq are a minority. So there's so many layers to this, groups I was born into, and then living in Tel Aviv and growing up there. So you have all of those sort of, I was born into this, and how did that affect me? Potential groups that could, now reflecting back on them, you probably have some interesting insights.
Yeah, that's a good question. Both the origin of Middle Eastern, Iraqi Jews. So that culture in particular is very emotionally expressive and warm and very high on hospitality. Whenever someone comes to your home, you offer them food and drink. And it's something that stayed with me as this value of hospitality and emotional warmth and expressiveness. And in the Jewish aspect, as a religious and culture, and also particularly Israel, is a culture of debate. The Talmudic scholars that worked on interpreting the Bible were always in debate about how to discover hidden meanings in the scripture and the text. And so it's a very Socratic method of debate, but it's for the sake of truth, not for the sake of ego or winning. It's called for the sake of heaven. So that's part of the culture. And in Israel, it's also a very strong culture that derives from that is a culture of being very direct and confrontational, and it could sometimes border on becoming aggressive. But certainly a value of taking responsibility. And, Jews have been persecuted throughout the ages, and they were running around, but they always had to move from one place to another to survive, but they always had to take responsibility and find a way to make things work. So it's a culture of self-responsibility. So there are different themes related to this upbringing that I had, and some of those values have certainly stayed with me and influenced who I am as an adult.
Yes, there would have been probably also, intergenerational traumas passed down. People just respond in a certain way as soon as a conflict emerges. That's the result of centuries of people being attacked, pogroms, being sent out of their homelands, and then having to start from scratch and reset everything.
Yeah.
When I read about the post-traumatic slave syndrome, I was thinking about that quite a bit, how much generations of people not having any agency and then having to react to whatever was thrown at them, and it frequently wasn't good, and how much that's affected people's actually at the DNA level. But they can heal from it. That's the other thing. People can heal when they start to engage in their own interpersonal and intrapersonal and intercultural healing. They then reset things so they don't continue to pass on a DNA that's been traumatized, which is the part that I was very hopeful about when I read.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you're bringing in this piece of intergenerational trauma, and the research both in humans and in lab animals is that trauma can pass up to, I think, 6-7 generations. And it's very mysterious how that happens through the DNA, through epigenetics, and so on. So, yeah, but we can do it, and we need to do all we can to heal this intergenerational. And it's a collective trauma also that impacts the very field or the fabric of our human society.
Yeah, I don't think there's any country or culture or group of people that hasn't been through some kind of a significant societal trauma, war, invasion, slavery. Most countries were built on the backs of slaves. So much of it, really, we have a lot to recover from and also to heal from. And moving forward, when you're saying with spiritual intelligence, it's a crying need. We can certainly see that happening in the world right now, that how badly we need it. And so tell me a little bit about your concept of spiritual intelligence. What does that mean to you, and how do you use that?
Okay, great. But I will certainly speak to that. I just want to rewind for one second when you talk about sort of collective trauma. One other piece which has been near and dear to my heart is the whole notion of gender as trauma. I think that we're all born in and we get enculturated. You're a boy, you're not supposed to cry. You're a girl, be nice, don't be too assertive, etc. All of which kind of flips our wings and our freedom for full expression of all the energies and latent potentials that we have. And I think that's a trauma that exists in everyone, is the way that we get enculturated around our gender.
I agree. I definitely agree.
Come more into the forefront of our understanding of late, and something I've been passionate about and organized the summit around healing conversations around gender. But anyway, so back to spiritual intelligence, which is my main passion and calling and personal mission, which is to awaken greater spiritual intelligence in myself and the world. And one of the main vehicles is through leadership. But let me first define what it is. So most people these days know what emotional intelligence is, right? So what is emotional intelligence? The ability to draw on emotional resources and information and to use that to help regulate our own and others' emotions and help our functioning and well-being. Now, prior to some of the research, the first paper on emotional intelligence was published in 1990 and then later popularized by Daniel Goleman in his book, Emotional Intelligence, in 95. There was a clear dichotomy between being emotional and being reasonable. So if you're a hiring manager and you're doing a reference call on someone and you're told, oh, so-and-so is emotional, you probably take that as a warning sign. Oh my God, I don't know. They're emotional, they're unpredictable, there's a lot of drama, or whatever we would associate with the notion of someone being emotional. It's certainly away from being reasonable or intelligent. But then came the idea of emotional intelligence that bridged the gap between emotion and reason. And so it's actually quite reasonable to be emotionally intelligent. It's very different than being emotional. Now, we have a similar dichotomy between practical and spiritual. But going back to emotional intelligence as the ability to draw on emotional resources and use that to help functioning and well-being. Spiritual intelligence would parallel that to mean it's the capacity to draw on spiritual resources and embody the spiritual qualities in daily life to enhance functioning and well-being. So what would be spiritual resources? Well, these would be qualities and virtues that have been hailed by all the world's spiritual traditions, things like purpose and service and gratitude and integrity and humility and presence and so on. And, the amazing thing that I uncovered in my research is that regardless of the spiritual tradition, whether they're theistic like Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, or Eastern traditions, non-theistic like Buddhism and Taoism, or earth-based spirituality, shamanic traditions, regardless of their cosmology and theology and metaphysics, they all value the notion of forgiveness and purpose and service and gratitude and beauty and joy and integrity and humility and higher self and intuition and so on. So these are qualities that have been recognized and hailed by all the traditions throughout the world, all the wisdom and spiritual traditions as qualities that enhance our well-being and the quality of our lives and our ability to get along with others.
And the ability to have healthy, functioning societies.
Exactly.
Yeah. You and I should read each other's books. My book is called The Spirit of Work, Timeless Wisdom, Current Realities. And I'm talking about all of the religious traditions and sacred traditions and how they inform the workplace and how they need to. And it sounds like your book is going to be similar. So we should probably read each other's books.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, first of all, it's exciting that now there's a growing recognition that this is important. And I'm delighted that your book is along the same lines. But what is also exciting is that there's now research that shows that these things actually contribute to both morale and well-being and so on, but as well as to the bottom line. So in my own doctoral research, I did a study with 42 CEOs and 210 members of their staff. And I found that leaders that showed greater spiritual intelligence led teams that had higher morale, greater commitment, and lower turnover. And that was after controlling for emotional intelligence. So when you're introducing a new variable like spiritual intelligence, you have to show that it contributes above and beyond other variables like emotional intelligence. It's very heartening to see that spiritual intelligence indeed contributed in a complementary way to emotional intelligence, that each of them contributed, but together they had a synergistic effect. And actually, the effect size of spiritual intelligence was larger than emotional intelligence. But
Yes, they're
certainly,
both necessary and complementary, but all the research that's been done on ethics and moral development and also on the calming of the nervous system shows that the effect of spiritual intelligence and the practice of spirituality and the practice of religion generally also produces better and more sustainable long-term results in people's lives. So yeah, it's really interesting. I want to get back to my questions about you though, because we could probably talk about this for a long time. So we found out a little bit about what affected your sense of self, culture, and leadership as you were growing up and as an adult. But people still have to feel like they belong as they grow older and they start to adopt different groups and they become part of their professional cultures as well. So what have you taken into yourself as an adult that you consciously brought into your own self culturally?
yeah. So it's kind of a dialectical relationship between who we are and groups we choose to associate with, and then how those groups and cultures and environments influence us. So
True, true.
it's like the river shapes the pattern of the riverbanks, and the riverbanks shape the flow of the water. So there's a
Exactly.
dialectical relationship between the two. So, when I came to the US, I chose to go to school for college and graduate school at MIT and studying engineering. And that was certainly a culture of intellectual curiosity and scientific rigor and so on. And that all informed and why I did my research on spiritual intelligence. It wasn't just, okay, this is a good idea, that sounds good, but I wanted to actually get the scientific basis. And a lot of that comes from MIT days and the belief in the importance of scientific rigor. And from there, when I looked at an MBA programs, I could have stayed at MIT, which was very quantitative and scientific, but I actually chose to go to Harvard, which was all the case method and using debate and Socratic method, because I felt that I needed to develop other skills that weren't just analytical, but the ability to reason and argue and collaborate with others. And I think that has certainly stayed with me.
But outside of academic and professional culture, I'm going to give you an example. So I spent some time in Japan studying at the United Nations University, and I really loved the way that people were reverent and the bow was extremely significant. I paid a lot of attention to bowing in what circumstances that was. And it was very difficult for me to stop bowing when I came back to Canada because I just felt like it was really natural to me. However, what was not natural to me was how the Japanese would change slippers between rooms in the house. I was constantly insulting people that I ended up visiting because I kept forgetting to change slippers between the living room and the bedroom and the doorway and the bathroom. And I was so confused by that. It wasn't natural and it was very difficult for me to get used to. And I certainly was happy not to have to deal with that when I came back to Canada. But the bowing piece was, and just this sense of reverence in a greeting that I had never experienced before was so strong that I felt that when I was greeting people, I needed to be more reverent, not just respectful, but to be reverent in that moment when you're meeting another human being. And so that really, really affected me on a bigger scale. There are smaller things too that affect people, like, what time you eat supper or if you even eat supper in your culture. But I'm just wondering if there's something that you have adopted into what you're doing as a result of your experience with other groups, cultures, ethnicities, races, travels.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm glad you're bringing up your time in Japan and the bowing. I mean, I've certainly spent time also in my business years in Japan and in India and elsewhere. My companies had a development team in Bangalore, India, and there was also that culture of bowing down. And that comes from this idea of namaste, which is
Kissing the feet to eventually, not just the namaste with the bow, but the actual real reverence where you're kissing somebody's feet to let them know how much you're differing to them.
It is the divine in me bows to the divine in you. I think
Yes.
a beautiful thing. But, certainly as I grew older and got more and more interested in spirituality, I joined a number of spiritual communities, both Jewish renewal and Buddhist community, and a particular path called the Diamond Approach, which is based on inquiry and love of truth. And those all highlighted the importance of service.
That just really built on what you were already believing, which is so typical of most adults. It's not like you jump into something from no experience, right? You came into it with some understanding of it, and then you just expanded it through these other experiences. Have you ever had a moment of cultural dissonance where you felt like you just had kind of a shock that people did things differently than the way you did in some aspect?
Well, first coming to the US, it was a bit of a awakening shock. I mean, I was used to a culture that was more emotionally expressive and warm, and touch was an important part of it, and so on. And then coming into the corporate world, or even before that in the US, there's more of a focus on privacy and distance. I mean, the Middle Eastern culture that I grew up in, there's a lot of emotional warmth and so on, but there wasn't so much emphasis on privacy. And as I mentioned, I grew up in a one-bedroom apartment with my grandparents. So as you can imagine, we didn't have much privacy. So, it took me a while to get used to this need for personal space and privacy and so on, and a greater level of formality and relating to people that I wasn't used to.
Those are great examples.
Yeah.
Definitely. What does it take to bring out the best in you? So if somebody hires you for something, what kind of an environment allows you to be yourself?
Well, I still am a big proponent and believer in directness and honesty. Nowadays there's one of the new buzzwords, which is something I've always believed in, and this idea of radical honesty. But, I've used to have some clients that say, I believe in brutal honesty. And I was like, it doesn't need to be brutal. It can be radically honest, but also needs to have kindness and positive regard. The honesty is coming from good intention for investing in the relationship, or the helping the other person grow and develop and having a better relationship with them. So I would say for me, it would be important to be in relationships where people are honest, but open and direct, but that's built on a foundation of kindness and positive regard, which leads to then regular mutual feedback that keeps our relationship clean and clear. So there aren't slights that are not processed or cleared between people, which just accumulates and contaminates the field, the space, the relationship. And for me, it would be important that there be a sort of a common agreed upon set of values that we share as sort of like the foundation of how are we relating to each other. And if we're both agreeing that frequent feedback, honesty, kindness, and so on, then that forms the charter, the bylaws, or what have you, for that relationship, that we're working towards a common vision of both how the relationship is there to function, but also what is the purpose of that relationship, whether it be a work team or a family relationship or whatever, or a romantic relationship or a marriage even, where we come together as two people to support each other in our calling and our work in the world. And that relationship becomes sacred. So
that's very articulate. I think you would win the prize for the best answer of all the 120 people I've interviewed.
Oh, okay.
Too bad I don't have a prize for you, especially a virtual one that I could send you.
That compliment was a prize worth more than your words of feedback are worth a lot more than, any prize you could give me.
Well, I'm telling you, I'm having a very hard time thinking of challenging questions to ask you. Usually they come unbidden to my mind, but everything that you says resonates with exactly what I think. So it's really hard for me to think that there's a lot of stuff I could challenge you on, because it would be challenging my own self.
Well, that would be good. I think that I'll challenge you to challenge yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we could work on that. But let me also ask you, you have a soapbox moment here, and it is time for you to promote whatever you would like to promote. So what would you like to promote? What would you like the Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners to know about?
Well, I think anybody who wants to become a more empowered and inspired leader, I would recommend you check out my book, Spiritually Intelligent Leadership, How to Inspire by Being Inspired. I think that it's full of case studies of my work with my clients that are very relatable, is the feedback I've gotten from all the people who have read and reviewed my book. And it also has attached to each chapter, each quality, be it beauty or joy or purpose or humility, there are exercises that are there to help people, because spiritual intelligence is not something you just read and understand cognitively.
No, you have to practice it.
You have to practice it, and you have to work and dive deeper into your own psyche and reprogram some things. So it's an experiential process to support that. each quality has exercises that people can use. So it's both full of relatable case studies and exercises. So I would certainly recommend my book. But
all right, we will put that in the show notes so that people can get the link to purchase it. And that
you
would
can
be
also
great.
check out my website, yosiamram.net. And through there's a link to another website that offers free assessments for spiritual intelligence. So anybody can go. And the website's called Intelligency, like intelligence, but instead of CE at the end, it's SI, which stands for the acronym Spiritual Intelligence. But anyway, you can get to it through my main website, yosiamram.net. And if you're interested, then you can get a free profile of your spiritual intelligence. And it's not to score you relative to others, but it just tells you what
where your spiritual strengths are.
Yeah, and where your personal opportunities for growth. And then there's also an assessment for spiritually intelligent leadership. And if you're courageous enough, you could do a 360 assessment as well, that you invite at least 4 other people to rate you on the same things.
Cool.
And
I think I should do this with my family. We should all rate each other.
You're courageous enough, and then you could compare your self-perception to that of the others in your 360, and you might discover pleasant surprises, things that you don't think you're so good at, but people around you think you're actually pretty strong at, and vice versa. There might be some yellow flags where you think, oh, I'm a very compassionate person, and maybe in your heart you are, but people around you don't
feel it. That's right. Let me just spell your name to the listeners in case they're not close to the show notes. I often listen to podcasts when I'm driving, so that would not be a time I'd be clicking on something. So it's YOSIAMRAM, Yosi Amram, just like it sounds, .net, correct?
Yeah, and I just emphasize that it's 2 M's, like Mary. Oftentimes people somehow put an N at the end of Amram.
Yeah, M like Mary. Got it. That's beautiful. Anything else you'd like to say before we end our interview today?
It's a pleasure, and I'm excited that people are interested in this topic. I think work is people's primary community, and the Surgeon General in the U.S. declared a pandemic of loneliness. And so I think for leaders at all levels to bring people together and give them a sense of belonging and community around a shared common purpose both makes people happy, the work quality is higher, and it results in better health and all kinds of things. There's lots of statistics now that speak to the importance of our belonging and connection and sense of community. So I think it's wonderful that we're looking at issues around culture and belonging and communities and bringing that to the workplace, because we spend more of our waking hours with those people. And now with hybrid workplaces and remote location, it's so challenging. And so
It is. Well, thank you so much for this time. I really appreciate it. And we will have to talk again about these topics. And I wish you a most wonderful day.
You too. Thank you. Thank you.
The journey from tech engineer to transpersonal psychologist would seem impossible for most people to imagine. Yet, this cocktail of childhood trauma with visionary business success, followed by public humiliation, eventually catapulted Dr. Yosi Amram to a place most people would not have suspected: practice and study of spiritual intelligence. I loved his focus on honesty with kindness in our communications, and his findings that the development of spiritual intelligence has even more positive outcomes for people than emotional intelligence. There were many insights from his interview which I will treasure. Here are a few of my takeaways. Number 1, understanding the effects of our own personal wounds is foundational to making progress in life. Number 2, promoting the combination of truth-seeking and fellow feeling brings wisdom. Number 3, we can learn more about creating a healthy society by bringing the virtues of the world's spiritual traditions into the workplace. And number 4, interpersonal warmth learned from the cultures of the Middle East could be a healing remedy to North American loneliness. I hope you enjoyed this podcast as much as I enjoyed recording it. And do share it with a friend who you think would be interested in this topic. Thank you for listening, and may culture and leadership connections continue to guide and inspire your day. Looking for a great new podcast to listen to? Consider Leader Talks with Anne-Marie Pham. It is an insightful interview-style podcast with Canadian guests currently working in or related to the field of diversity and inclusion. Anne-Marie Pham courageously and tactfully addresses current issues through the insights of wise experts from diverse fields. These personal conversations bring a moderating influence to topics that otherwise would seem intractable. As a bonus, if you listen on or after April 28th, which is the International Day of Health and Safety at Work, you will hear Anne-Marie's interview with me about emotional and cultural safety at work. Go to ccdi.ca/podcast. That is ccdi.ca/podcast. The show is called Leader Talks with Anne-Marie Pham. Newsflash. Listeners can now interact with Culture and Leadership Connections podcast by leaving a voice or text message on Fan List. It is a fun and quick way to let me know what you liked, ask a question, or leave a suggestion. I will feature some of the voice messages on upcoming episodes. You might be surprised to hear your own voice, but only if you leave a message, of course. So to leave your personal message or your question, go to shiftworkplace.com/podcast and click on the Fan List link to leave it. I can hardly wait to hear what you have to say.